Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. This week's episode of Horns of a Dilemma is a bit of a swashbuckler. It begins with the daring escape of a POW and wanted war criminal from Lithuania just after the end of the First World War. What was Enver Pasha, a former official of the Ottoman state, doing transporting secret German documents to the Soviet Union at that time? Ian Johnson, the Moran Family Assistant Professor of Military History at Notre Dame, explains as he talks about his new book, Faustian Bargain, which details the cooperation between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in the lead-up to World War II. While many of us think of that cooperation as beginning and ending with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and ending with Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union by the Nazis in 1941, in fact, as Johnson details, there was close cooperation between the Germans and Soviets throughout the 1920s and 30s, leading to the rearmament of Nazi Germany, as well as to substantial technological and training benefits to the Soviet Union. Johnson explains this cooperation and also details how each state was dependent on the other for material, for production, as well as for tactics and training, and also discusses how the cooperation may have helped to explain Stalin's Great Purge. Let's listen in.
It's a pleasure to be back. Thank you, Will. Thank you, Elizabeth, for making this possible. It's really just wonderful to be back and sharing the story of a book that, in many ways, much of it was written here. It really evolved from dissertation to book, here at UT as a Clements Center Fellow. So it's great to be able to share the final product with all of you. Today, I'm going to be speaking about my new book, Faustian Bargain, the Soviet-German Partnership and the Origins of the Second World War. The story of that book is about how the Second World War began just 2 brief decades after the First, supposedly the war to end all wars. The Second World War in Europe began, and it's important to note this, on September 1st, 1939, when 50 divisions of the reborn German army invaded Poland from the west. Great Britain and France honored their pledges to Poland, declaring war on Germany 48 hours later. And to the surprise and chagrin of much of the world, the Soviet Union soon invaded Poland from the east on September 17th, 1939. The Second World War had begun. The fact that the Second World War began with the Soviets and Germans working together and over the question of Poland was a product of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. On the 23rd of August, 1939, about a week before the war actually began, Hitler and Stalin had agreed to partition Eastern Europe between them, exchange military equipment, and in the Soviet case, supply large quantities of raw materials to the German state. The story of that Soviet-German pact in 1939 is often seen as one of rank opportunism. 2 dictators who despised each other temporarily saw advantage in reaching some sort of accord. But in fact, Germany and the Soviet Union had been working together for most of the preceding 2 decades. Their partnership in 1939 marked the culmination of a relationship that had begun in the dying embers of the First World War. My story is that story, the story of how 20 years of on-again, off-again cooperation between 2 pariah states led the world back to war, a war more horrific than the First World War in its death toll and consequences. The story ends with the Second World War, but it starts with secret diplomacy at the very end of the First. In the spring of 1919, the world finally seemed to be returning to peace. Germany had been defeated, and the victorious Allies were then meeting in Paris to discuss exactly what should be done with the defeated powers, particularly Germany. In April 1919, as those negotiations were ongoing, a young German officer named Fritz Schunke, then 30 years old, was tasked, quite remarkably, with trying to avoid having the First World War break out again. Schunke was then serving as a liaison officer with the Lithuanian army in the then capital city of Kovno. Lithuania had just been resurrected as an independent state by the victorious Allies. The Reichswehr, the post-First World War German army, had assigned the young Schunke to assist in dismantling Germany's briefly established empire in Eastern Europe. Sitting him in his tiny, orderly room, a closet on a Lithuanian army base, the officer Shunka noticed a pale-looking and disheveled man, this man pictured here, being dragged by armed guards down the hallway, out of sight, taken to one of the small number of cells on the Lithuanian base. He knew who this man was. It was Enver Pasha, the former Turkish Minister of War. Pasha was on the Allied powers' list of war criminals. In fact, he was very near the top, with a bounty on his head. He had been largely responsible for the Armenian genocide during the First World War. Shunka had served in Turkey during the war and recognized him. And after talking to one of his Lithuanian acquaintances on the base, he quickly realized the Lithuanians had no idea who he was. This gentleman, he was told, had been carrying identity papers that identified him as a Turkish Red Cross volunteer. He had been on a plane that had crash-landed just outside of the base, very mysterious. And uncertain about his identity, the Lithuanians decided to detain him until they could figure out who he really was. Shunka snuck into the jail cell late one evening, a few days later, and met with the Pasha alone. He learned that the Pasha had been traveling from Berlin to Moscow on a top-secret mission, but his plane had developed mechanical issues and been forced to make an emergency landing in Lithuania. Then, to Shunka's horror, the Pasha whispered to him between the bars of his cell that, quote, important maps and documents from the German general staff destined for the Bolsheviks in Moscow were hidden on the airplane, crashed outside of the base. Shunka realized that if the Allies got a hold of these documents, then being transported from Germany to Bolshevik Russia, with whom at that juncture the Allies were still at war, the consequences could be catastrophic. The Allies might even consider the complete occupation of Germany. That night, Shunka broke into the damaged airplane with the assistance of a mercenary former German pilot, then in the employ of the Lithuanian Air Force, and they retrieved and destroyed all of the sensitive materials inside. But Shunka knew to avoid catastrophic scandal, he also had to get the Pasha out of the country before anyone knew his true identity. Taking advantage of his position as liaison, he convinced the Lithuanian guards responsible for the Pasha to give the unrecognized prisoner the right to go for walks at the edge of the airbase. The airbase was bordered by a civilian airstrip, and Shunka arranged for a plane to be waiting, taxiing on that runway on one of the days when the Pasha was being taken for a walk by his guards. On the appointed day, Shunka ordered his mercenary buddy and several of his acquaintances to have the aircraft ready to go. At a designated time, a shot was fired, and the Pasha, then in his early 50s, took off at a dead run across a meadow to the civilian airstrip. His guards, shocked for a moment, waited a few seconds and then opened fire. With bullets whizzing over his head, the Pasha jumped into the open door of the plane, was pulled inside. The aircraft took off, wheeled in the direction of Germany, safely away. Now, Shunka, as you might imagine, was very confused why a Turkish war criminal had secret documents from the German general staff on his way to Moscow in 1919. But he would soon learn the mystery as he would be brought into essentially a grand conspiracy to secretly rearm the German state. He learned that German General Hans von Zeigt, in charge of the Reichswehr after the First World War, and Bolshevik revolutionary Karl Radek, then in a Berlin prison cell for his part in trying to organize a revolution, had begun meeting together and concluded that Germany and the new Soviet state might have more in common than they had thought. They hoped to arrange a covert military pact between Germany and Soviet Russia. But traveling over a vast region riven by war, famine, and disease, it would take 2 more attempts, another brief prison sentence or time in a jail cell, and almost a year before Enver Pasha would finally make it to Moscow and open channels of communication between the two militaries. From the perspective of 1919, and for young officers like Shunka, the idea that the German military would work with the Bolshevik revolutionaries then in the midst of their civil war was almost impossible to fathom. It's hard to overstate how much the two sides absolutely hated one another. These posters give some indication here. A Soviet poster saying "kill him" with a German soldier depicted as a gorilla. And then we've got this lovely German poster essentially arguing for encouraging veterans to join a militia to fight against Bolshevik revolution. In the same year, the two sides began negotiating together. To give you a further sense of their views of each other, Lenin would publicly call the German military savages, plunderers, and predators, and note that in the First World War, the German robber barons broke all records in war atrocities. For the Bolsheviks, the right-wing officers with whom they began to negotiate in 1919, they were really the archetypes of counter-revolution, the villains of Soviet propaganda. The German officer corps, for their part, were about as fond of their future Soviet allies. A German veteran and Reichswehr non-commissioned officer would write that, quote, "The rulers of present-day Russia are common blood-stained criminals, the scum of humanity, carrying on the most cruel and tyrannical regime of all time." This was more or less the common view in 1919. So why did two groups, the German military and the Soviet state, who saw each other as the literal embodiment of evil, make a deal with one another? Well, it was their hostility to the international order as established after the First World War that first brought them together. In the summer of 1919, the Allies, the British, French, Americans, and Italians, had agreed upon the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which ended Germany's participation in the First World War. Germany was to be forcibly disarmed and to pay reparations. Foreign troops would occupy the country's industrial heartland. Germany would lose over 10% of its land area to its neighbors, particularly the new state of Poland to Germany's east. In addition, the victorious Allies completely dismantled the vaunted German military of the First World War, reducing the army to only 100,000 men from a previous total of 5 million. Germany was further banned from possessing aircraft, armored vehicles, submarines, chemical weapons, all of the modern accoutrements of war. Allied inspectors would be stationed across Germany to superintend the destruction of weapon stockpiles, destroy munitions factories, and guarantee that Germany could not rearm and start a new world war. The terms were viewed as so harsh by the remnants of the German high command that they actually held a secret conference after the terms were announced to discuss the possibility of reopening hostilities. But in the end, they concluded resistance was impossible, at least while there were so many American troops still in Europe. Instead, they agreed to immediately embark upon a program to restore Germany's military might surreptitiously, largely concealed even from their own government. Their aims were essentially a war of revenge against France and Poland. That's clear even from 1919. Not just overturning the treaty, that was certainly an ambition, but actually overturning the results of the First World War entirely. Now, meanwhile, 1,000 miles to their east, the Soviet Union was not yet in existence. The Bolshevik Revolution was in the midst of a desperate struggle for its very survival against the combined forces of 18 different Allied armies then operating on Russian soil, as well as the Whites, various anti-Bolshevik forces operating within the former Tsarist Empire. Not until late fall of 1919 was it clear that the Bolsheviks, in fact, would survive these various challenges. And once they did eventually emerge victorious in 1920, Soviet Russia suffered from a massive famine, was devastated by cholera and typhus, and its economy was in complete and utter ruin. It was in this moment of isolation that the two pariah groups, the German military and the Soviet state, would begin to exchange military envoys, intelligence, and technology. There was a war ongoing between the new state of Poland and Bolshevik Russia at that juncture, which further highlighted how much the two sides had in common. Molotov, the future foreign minister, would call Poland that monstrous bastard of Versailles in official correspondence. And General von Seeckt in Berlin, for his part, would pledge to the army officers at conferences to, quote, wipe Poland off the map of the world. The first secret military conference was held not long thereafter, in the summer of 1921. In April 1922, Soviet Russia and Weimar Germany signed the Treaty of Rapallo, which normalized diplomatic relations between the two sides. 5 months later, People's Commissar for Military and Naval Affairs Leon Trotsky and German General Hans von Seeckt began to establish a series of secret arrangements to initiate secret military cooperation. What did these two archenemies hope to achieve by working together? General Hans von Seeckt, who looks very much like the Prussian archetype here with his monocle, he was commanding the Reichswehr in the aftermath of the First World War, and his ultimate aim was to rebuild German military power inside of the USSR, away from the Allied inspection teams and occupying forces then in Germany. He had 3 means to this end. First, he hoped to relocate critical German military industry to the USSR. German engineers could maintain their employment, remain in military-relevant fields, and build up stockpiles of weapons for use in the event of a new war with France. Next, he foresaw that German officers, quite few in number, after the war, with their strength capped at 4,000 by the terms of Versailles, should be trained on the most advanced technologies of the day. They could become superior to their Western adversaries through professionalism and mastery of technological know-how, Zayt believed. But to do so, they needed access to planes, to tanks, to submarines, chemical weapons, things that could not be done in Germany. The USSR was the only place this might be done. This is how the German army was training for tank warfare before their partnership with Soviet Russia. We've got a gentleman driving a car here and papier-mâché outlines of tank parts here. And these poor officers have to stand during maneuvers for 12 hours holding these fake bits and pretend to be a tank on the battlefield. Aircraft were simulated in similar fashion. Motorcycles, rather sadly, from the German perspective, with papier-mâché wings attached to them to give them some semblance of an aircraft. This was hardly the sort of modern professional army that Zayt wanted. He needed to professionalize and train with actual technologies of war. In addition, Zayt wanted to develop the new technologies of war themselves. Tanks, aircraft, submarine prototypes could not be developed in Germany. He needed to find a home for technological development. The USSR could serve as that place. Now, how about the Soviets? What did Leon Trotsky, then heading the Red Army, intend from this partnership? He sought to rebuild a devastated USSR with German assistance. He saw the relocation of German industry as a critical means of industrializing the Soviet Union. He also hoped to have German officers train and prepare the next generation of professional Soviet officers, engineers, and scientists, in part because the Red Army was in disastrous shape in the aftermath of the Russian Civil War. The majority of men, according to their own internal studies, had no uniforms or working weapons. A majority of the officer corps were untrustworthy Tsarist-era officers, many of whom were aristocrats. They were monitored closely by political commissars, a system Trotsky had created, but this was hardly an ideal solution. The entire Soviet Air Force was down to 73 aircraft in 1922, most of which were considered completely unsafe to fly. And most of the Red Army's rusting tank forces were redeployed to plow farm fields in Ukraine in 1923. Trotsky wanted German help in developing a new professional officer corps and arming it with new technologies to safeguard the Bolshevik Revolution. As a result, between 1922 and 1933, the Soviets and Germans would together build a network of secret facilities, factories, and military bases throughout the USSR to achieve these goals. And I've highlighted the locations of a few of the key ones that I'll mention briefly here. The first element of their partnership, and one that would continue fitfully all the way until the day that Germany betrayed the USSR and invaded in 1941, centered on German corporations relocating to the USSR and developing Soviet military industry. This provided employment for German engineers, scientists, and technicians, preserving a core of know-how that German military leadership viewed as essential for the next war. The Germans would relocate entire factories producing banned munitions, particularly chemical weapons and aviation. This is a former auto plant the Soviet state sold to a German firm through the mediation of the German military, which was operating essentially a secret shell corporation that would serve as a home for negotiations in Moscow between German firms and the Soviet state. And this facility would play a key role in building aircraft for the Soviet Air Force. It would produce the first single-seater fighters built in Soviet Russia after the Civil War, as well as eventually the first Soviet four-engine bombers, the TB-3, later in the 1920s. Several thousand Russian workers were employed here, operating under German and Russian engineers and overseen by German management teams from Junkers AG. Other facilities sprang up on this model across Soviet Russia, working on artillery, tanks, chemical weapons, rifles, machine guns, submarines, just about anything with military utility. The scale of economic cooperation would grow to gigantic proportions, much of it, again, mediated by the German military itself. More than 255 German firms would receive contracts from the Red Army in the 1920s alone to build weapons or to update and manage factories. To give you some sense of how significant this was, just one indication. By 1940, the Soviet government estimated that 50% of all Soviet tank production was dependent on German-built, designed, or managed factories. Now, as these corporate facilities took off, German military leadership sought the means to expand direct military-to-military cooperation. These shared corporate facilities could only really serve the first part of von Zayt's plan. He needed to also train military officers and develop new prototypes. The first of the arrangements that would be reached with the Russian state would center on salvaging Germany's air power. In 1923, Zeke would reach an agreement to begin sending German pilots, mostly World War I aces, to this air base located in Lipetsk in south-central Russia. There, their task was to train Soviet cadets on basic flight technique. After 24 months, the German military reached an agreement to acquire the entire base on a lease from the Soviet state. In exchange for training Soviet pilots and mechanics, and allowing the Soviets essentially access to any prototypes that might be brought to the base, the Germans were allowed to do whatever they wanted. And what they wanted to do in particular was train new pilots and test new equipment. The students selected by the Reichswehr to study at Lipetsk were supposed to be the best. They were also supposed to be very young, and I think this gives us some indication of German military thinking. German military planners believed that they intended to start a new war in somewhere between 10 and 15 years away in 1923. They wanted men between the ages of 18 and 25 who would thus be in their primes when that next war began, in the position to command squadrons and train new pilots. Of course, their timeline was quite accurate, as it turns out. These young cadets would begin their training with 6 months of basic flight training at a commercial flight school in Germany, administered by the Reichswehr. Then the best graduates of this program would depart for Lipetsk in the spring. Upon arrival, they'd be put through a strict training regimen. Monday through Friday, they'd wake up for 2 hours of flight training early in the morning, led by famed World War I aces, most of whom would serve as generals in the Luftwaffe during the Second World War. The young pilots then had about an hour of class on aircraft maintenance, an hour of technical instruction, rotating lectures covering tactics, organization, metal aircraft, followed by a tea break, appropriately for those studying in Russia. Their long day would conclude with shooting and tactical lessons. Interestingly, they dressed the dummies up in Polish uniforms on the firing range, quite tellingly, and then would conclude with Russian language training in the evening, as well as, to their great reluctance, lectures on Stalin's 5-year plan beginning in 1929. Now, these young men were supposed to be disguised as tourists. There weren't a great deal of tourists arriving in the USSR in, say, 1925, and they weren't particularly good at playing tourists. You can see that these young men have lined up by height, as they would on a parade ground, and they're also all wearing military shoes here. This was a frequent source of concern by the German military, that someone would discover their secret operations in the USSR. It could be very dangerous to learn how to fly at this facility. Dozens of would-be trainees were hurt or killed learning their craft. In fact, an entire complicated transportation network had to be set up to ship the bodies of dead trainee pilots back to Germany in boxes labeled machine tool parts. But they also had some fun thrown in with their flying. You can see here a New Year's party, German and Russian officers here. The German officers were allowed to bring their wives for certain periods of time. Many of the young German pilots had local girlfriends. Quite amazing to think that so many senior officers in the Luftwaffe had once dated or even considered marrying Russian civilians during their time in the 1920s. The Soviet secret police occasionally arrested young women for fraternizing with the Germans, but until things became increasingly tense in the early 30s, by and large, most officers could get away with this. They played games, they threw parties with their Soviet counterparts, just like the New Year's picture here. What is remarkable, though, amidst these scenes of frivolity, that was a few years after this photo was taken, and again, when this sort of thing was still common, thousands of Soviet civilians were starving to death just outside of the gates of the base as a result of Soviet agricultural policies. And the Germans noted that famine victims would frequently try to climb over the barbed wire fences of the camp and be shot down by the guards trying to get access to food. The Germans got a lot out of these facilities. New pilots, new tactics, new technologies. Nearly 1,000 pilots, mechanics, and observers would be trained there. For context, about the entire size of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, when Hitler reformed it in 1935. 22 officers who had achieved the rank of 3-star general or higher in the Luftwaffe had either taught, studied, or commanded the facility here. One alumni would write after the Second World War that, quote, the spiritual foundations of the entire Luftwaffe were developed on that aeronautical field, end quote. So what did the Soviets get out of all of this? They too trained pilots and mechanics and engineers alongside their German counterparts. But their main goal at this facility was to gain access to German technology. Germany made some of the best planes in the world at this juncture, and the Soviets wanted them. In addition, because Germany had nowhere else to test new combat aircraft, new designs, it was illegal in Germany, as I've noted. Essentially, all of the aircraft manufacturers in Germany, with one exception, would send all of their cutting-edge designs to Lipetsk. Some borrowing by the Soviets was allowed, of course, under the terms of their agreement, but the Soviets consistently believed the Germans were holding out on them. The Germans consistently complained that they would wake up in the morning to find parts or blueprints moved around or missing each morning at the base. The Soviets had intelligence personnel stationed at the base breaking into various facilities and photographing or disassembling materials every night, trying to copy it or steal it. Now, Lipetsk was hardly the only place where this sort of technological experimentation was underway. A few miles away, near the city of Kazan, the Germans and Soviets had another joint base operating, codenamed Kama. This one was dedicated to tank warfare. It had opened about a year after the founding of Lipetsk and operated for 7 years. During that time, the facility hosted the most prominent theorists of armored warfare on both sides, names like Heinz Guderian and Mikhail Tukhachevsky. The school graduated about 200 officers between the two sides. Among the German alumni, 17 of them would reach the rank of divisional commander in the war or above. For context, the entire German army had 18 armored divisions in 1941, most of them commanded by alumni of this facility. And in addition, nearly every tank that the German army would deploy in the first 4 years of the war, up until 1943, had been tested first at this facility or was one generation removed. It was essentially based on prototype development done at Kama. In other words, Germany would not have had armored forces at all had it not been for this facility. The most secretive element of this secret network centered on chemical weapons production and testing. Relying on human testing, sometimes on a huge scale, the Soviets and Germans jointly experimented with new chemical agents at a pair of facilities, one located in the Moscow suburbs, which proved quite dangerous as there were frequent incidents of gassing civilians in the nearby apartment complexes, not particularly positive, and then a much larger facility that would move out to the environs of Samara, out in central Russia in 1927. This picture here, for those interested, most of the individuals pictured were famous German scientists. Several Nobel Prize winners were on the staff of this facility, operating secretly. Many of them still held research appointments at German universities and were essentially on leave or sabbatical while developing new chemical weapons techniques and tactics. You could also see some very unfortunate graduate students in the back row. When new techniques or chemical agents were to be tested, many times these graduate students were used as human guinea pigs by their advisors. My advisor reminded me how fortunate I was completing my dissertation compared to their unfortunate experiences. I argue in my book, and I'd be happy to discuss this more in the Q&A, that the joint testing played a major role in changing how chemical warfare would evolve in the interwar period. In the First World War, of course, chemical weapons had been used on a huge scale. At these joint facilities, the thing that German and Soviet scientists so wanted to know was whether or not chemical weapons could be used in conjunction with strategic bombing. Could, for instance, the German Air Force spray the entire city of Paris with phosgene or chlorine or mustard gas, wipe out the population and leave the buildings intact, occupy it bloodlessly? Rather horrifying prospect, of course. These scientists built essentially model villages or towns, replete with dogs as their residents in cages, and then sprayed them with different chemical agents from aircraft to test this possibility. Both Soviet and German teams concluded that this was not yet practical. The chemical agents they tested tended to disperse in air, and as a result, both Germany and the USSR would move away from first use of chemical weapons. And of course, in the Second World War in Europe, chemical weapons were not used on any large scale, I believe in part as a result of this experimentation. You can see here a picture of animal cages being set up for this sort of aviation testing. Between 1922 and 1933, this Soviet-German network I've described grew to huge proportions. But then, of course, in January 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Cooperation played a major role in that process. I'll just touch on it briefly. The German military had actually refused to assist Chancellor Schleicher in resisting the Nazis in 1932. The key figure who helped lead the German military into the Nazi era was none other than Werner von Blomberg. Like many senior German officers, his time living in the USSR had actually brought him into the Nazi fold. He told a fellow officer in 1933 who asked him why he was so supportive of Hitler that, quote, "I have seen in Soviet Russia what can be got out of the masses. My trips to the USSR in the 1920s turned me into a Nazi," end quote. General von Seeckt, who actually entered politics after being dismissed for political reasons in 1926, largely concurred. At a meeting with Hitler in 1935, he told the Führer that, quote, "Our paths were different, but our aims were the same," end quote. In any case, now in power, Hitler decided that many of the facilities in the USSR were no longer necessary. He felt confident that the Allies would no longer enforce the terms of Versailles strenuously and began relocating testing facilities and training facilities back to Germany. But nonetheless, he actually did not suspend cooperation, not for a while. German officers were still training in the USSR through September and October 1939, and cooperation continued at corporate facilities throughout the 30s. Not until 1935 would the last elements of submarine development done jointly be ended, for instance. I'm going to stop the narrative here, and I want to talk about some of the bigger takeaways of this period of cooperation, how it led to the Second World War, where I began today's talk. As I've tried to lay out here, Germany was completely dependent on its secret facilities in the Soviet Union for its rearmament after the First World War. Because of Hitler, the bonds of Versailles were shed very suddenly between 1933 and 1935. Hitler had decided to accelerate an arms race that had actually already begun before him under the Reichswehr. He poured funding into rearmament, rapidly catching and then surpassing the British and French in aircraft and armored vehicle design. Now, keep in mind that it took between 4 and 6 years in this period to develop a new tank or aircraft prototype from scratch. French and British military spending in the face of Germany's threat did not increase until about 1937, in 1938 in the case of France. This meant that they found themselves behind in a growing arms race. And in the face of their slow response, Hitler continued to accelerate German rearmament. German military expenditures grew from 0.3% of GDP to 5.5% by the end of 1935. By the end of that year, thanks to all of the testing that had been conducted in the USSR, the Luftwaffe had already received 5,568 aircraft. More than 500 new generation tanks had been issued to the Wehrmacht. In October 1935, heavier tanks were entering mass production. In other words, the window to halt German rearmament without a world war was shrinking rapidly, not at the time of the Munich Conference, but all the way in 1935. And there was broad awareness that this was taking place in Paris and London, concern over the pace of German rearmament. We have a political cartoon here about appeasement here. The original caption reads, "How much will you give me not to kick your pants for, say, 25 years? Hitler glowering at British and French statesmen. And the date is 1936, quite a bit earlier than we traditionally think about appeasement. To give a further sense of this, when Hitler marched into the previously demilitarized Rhineland in 1936 in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, the French government in Paris summoned the general staff and asked them what military responses could be made. The chief of the French general staff informed Prime Minister Sarrat that the French military could respond to Hitler's remilitarization of the Rhineland if their funding was significantly increased, but not for 12 months. As the chief of staff gloomily concluded, the German army is already the strongest in Europe. If the French should move into the Rhineland to stop Hitler, they would start a general war which would devolve into trench warfare. Thanks to Germany's lead in the arms race, its larger population and military industry, France would lose. Therefore, he argued, no military action should be taken to resist Hitler. The assessment of the British government in this period was much the same. It was part of the reason behind the 1935 Naval Agreement, the first agreement to acknowledge that Germany had the right to rearm, and of course the infamous Munich Agreement in 1938. The perception was that Hitler was ahead in an arms race and that he either had to be bought off or delayed until the British and French could catch up. In other words, the foundation laid by 11 years of secret rearmament paid immediate dividends for Germany once Hitler came to power, deterring intervention against Hitler as he achieved one foreign policy goal after another between 1933 and 1938. There was another important factor in preventing an effective coalition from developing against Germany, and that was one related to secret rearmament in the USSR. On June 2nd, 1937, at a meeting of the Revolutionary Military Council in Moscow, Stalin made a surprise appearance. He announced the shocking news that Deputy Commissar of Defense Mikhail Tukhachevsky, the second most senior military officer in the country, had committed treason and been arrested. Stalin delivered a meandering, contradictory speech in which he concluded that, "Comrades, I hope no one doubts now that a military political plot against Soviet power exists," end quote. He claimed that Tukhachevsky was planning to pass the USSR's operational plans to Germany. Tukhachevsky and 9 of his fellow officers were accused of being part of a Trotskyite anti-Soviet spy ring that had been working with the Germans for nearly 2 decades. In the 10 days after Tukhachevsky's arrest, nearly 1,000 senior Soviet officers were arrested, tortured, and in many cases shot. In total, the purges would claim 11% of the entire Soviet officer corps over the next 18 months, with disproportionately higher numbers of arrests and executions at the highest ranks. For instance, 90% of all officers holding the rank of division commander or above would be arrested during the purges. The arrest decimated military intelligence, logistics, research, and support services too. Quite remarkably, somewhere between 3 and 4 times as many general officers were shot by Stalin in the purges as would die in the entire Second World War. The logic of the Great Terror, as this maelstrom of repression would become known, remains debated. Some scholars variously argue that Stalin sought to consolidate control over the military, that he was concerned about the political reliability of his officers, that he actually believed a coup was imminent. But the German role in educating so many Soviet officers has been neglected among the explanations presented. This is surprising, as it is actually the official reason that Tukhachevsky and so many of his fellow officers were killed. Stalin was clearly concerned that the Red Army might not be a reliable instrument in the event of war with Germany. As a result, officers who had worked with the Germans dominated the senior ranks of the Red Army from their time of cooperation and were disproportionately targeted as a result. Paranoid as he was, Stalin must have noted how many of his senior personnel had lived, studied, or trained in Germany, his most likely military adversary in 1937. This logic can be seen in the selection of victims. Stalin personally requested lists of all senior officers who had lived in Germany shortly before the purges, documents I've seen in the original. In 1937, that list included 2 of the Soviet Union's 5 marshals, the highest rank in the Red Army, the commander of the Soviet Air Forces, the head of all Soviet military education, civil defense, the head of all naval construction, the heads of all major military academies in the country, as well as most of the frontline corps and division commander equivalents. They were all German-trained officers. Almost none survived until 1941. The obliteration of those who worked with the Germans, in fact, would go much, much deeper. According to the memoirs of one Red Army officer who had been stationed at Kama after the purges, which was still in operation, everyone who had been there when the Germans had been there would be arrested by 1938, including plumbers, janitors, and waitresses at the camp mess hall. The accusations made at the show trials, the internal justification for the purges, and the selection of victims all suggest that the history of cooperation between Germany and the USSR was among the reasons that Stalin initiated the Great Terror in the first place. And the consequences of the Great Terror are hard to understate. The British and French, who had been negotiating with Moscow to build a collective security organization, an anti-Nazi coalition since 1935, immediately recoiled in horror. New British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain told his cabinet, quote, "Russia has become an unreliable friend with very little capacity for assistance, but with an enormous irritative effect on others," end quote. The French General Staff informed the French Prime Minister that the USSR in the event of war would be a useless ally because of the deaths of so many competent officers and men. Already distrustful of the Soviet state, the purges made it essentially impossible to build any sort of coalition against Hitler. It also led British and French policymakers to exclude Stalin from the Munich Conference. The USSR actually had a defensive pact with Czechoslovakia and might likely have been included had it not been for the purges. And it's critical to note as well that immediately following Stalin's exclusion from Munich in 1938, he began having his diplomats reach out to Nazi Germany. By January 1939, just 3 months after the Munich Conference met, the Soviets were prepared to discuss broad economic and political settlement with Hitler and entered into negotiations with the German Foreign Office to that very end. Now, these initial talks didn't go anywhere as Hitler, for his part, was still reluctant to deal with the communists in Moscow. He preferred potential partnerships with Poland and other states. But in April 1939, Hitler suddenly concluded that the USSR would be a better partner, at least in the short term. That month, interestingly, Stalin received word from the German Foreign Ministry that Hitler desired to, quote, renew the old Rapallo relationship of the 1920s, end quote. Important here that it was being couched in terms of a renewal, not some about-face. As I said at the beginning of my talk, in August 1939, Germany and the USSR had agreed to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a treaty that partitioned Eastern Europe between them, with Stalin receiving the lion's share of territory in exchange for assisting Germany in partitioning Poland. In exchange, the USSR was also expected to supply Germany with oil, with other critical raw materials, and assist in Germany's war at sea against Great Britain. Much as in the 1920s and early 1930s, the Germans would reopen military facilities on Soviet soil, including a major naval base near Murmansk in northern Russia. In addition, they would sell huge quantities of weapons to the Soviets and send engineers once again to Soviet factories and shipyards to assist in building up the Soviet military. It was, in many senses, a very intimate and close relationship at its inception. But most importantly, their renewed partnership would pave the way for Hitler's invasion of Poland just about a week later, on September 1st, 1939. Stalin, following the agreement, invaded from the east some 16 days later. Soviet and German forces met in central Poland on September 18th, as remaining Polish forces fought their way southeast into neutral Romania. On September 22nd, 1939, German General Heinz Guderian, pictured here on the left, and Semyon Krivoshein on the right, met in the town of Brest-Litovsk. It had been taken by German forces, but was now being turned over to Soviet forces under Krivoshain's command. The two men very likely were acquaintances. They had both studied and learned their trade, tank warfare, at Kama. Speaking in French, a language they both knew, the two officers agreed to hold a joint victory parade to commemorate Soviet-German defeat of Poland. Guderian's forces were to pull out of town as it was being turned over to the Soviets that evening. At 4 p.m. on that cool autumn afternoon, Guderian and Krivoshein met on this hastily constructed wooden platform along Brest-Litovsk main street to watch the joint procession of German and Soviet troops arm in arm marching through town. They chatted pleasantly as their soldiers passed the reviewing stand. Although they'd told their soldiers not to fraternize, their men exchanged cigarettes, climbed on each other's vehicles, compared uniforms, exchanged postcards. This was the high point of the Soviet-German relationship. Only 22 months later, the two states would be at war with one another. On June 22nd, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in world history. 3 million German soldiers and hundreds of thousands of their allies marched into the USSR as part of the offensive. More than 30 million people would die on the Eastern Front over the next 4 years. What is remarkable is how much these two adversaries, in fact, had in common. Rarely in the history of the world have two opponents spent so much time preparing each other for war with one another. Invading German forces marched on rubber boots made from material shipped over the Trans-Siberian Railway. Their rations include Soviet grain, which had continued to arrive up until the very day of the invasion. Their ammunition contained chrome, nickel, steel, and manganese, all mined in the USSR. And German vehicles and aircraft drew heavily from the legacy of engineering work conducted in Russia. Many of them had actually been first designed and tested there. They were fueled by Soviet oil that had been pumped in the Caucasus. And many senior German officers had trained in the USSR. Quite a few even spoke good Russian from their time there. And when they issued orders, they drew, at least in part, and in some cases very heavily, on training manuals that had actually been written in the USSR in collaboration with Red Army officers. Across the lines, the story was much the same. Although few senior living Soviet officers had trained alongside the Germans as a result of the purges, most had trained in facilities organized along German lines and in many instances staffed by German officers. Among the Red Army's most famed professors in the 1920s and 30s were men like Erich von Manstein, Walter Mödel, Friedrich von Paulus, famous for his defeat and capture at Stalingrad, and Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, the future head of the OKW overseeing the entire German war effort. Soviet operations, for their part, were managed by a Soviet general staff that was essentially plagiarized from the German counterpart. Its head in 1941 was Marshal Semyon Timoshenko, who had studied in Germany in 1931 and spoke German. Their tanks, aircraft, and artillery that they would use to resist the initial German onslaught drew heavily from German designs. In one instance, there had actually been a very embarrassing suit by a German manufacturing alleged that his designs had been stolen and were in mass production by the Red Army in the late 1930s. Many others were copies of German designs produced under license or equipment acquired as part of various Soviet-German economic agreements. Many were powered by German-designed engines, particularly BMW ones. And the vehicles and aircraft themselves had been built in factories constructed with German help, equipped with German machine tools, and powered by coal that had been mined in Germany not long before. As news of the German attack filtered back from the West, Stalin reacted with disbelief. Surely, he told the Politburo, Hitler would not just attack like some brigand. He told Foreign Minister Molotov to find the German ambassador. Ambassador Schulenburg duly arrived in Molotov's office later that morning. As Molotov sat quietly, Schulenburg read a memorandum accusing the USSR of breaking the German-Soviet pact. Schulenburg concluded his remarks and a pregnant silence hung in the air of Molotov's office. Molotov asked him heatedly, "Is this supposed to be a declaration of war?" Schulenburg merely shrugged. He'd been given no instructions on that point. Molotov replied heatedly that it could be nothing else, as, quote, German troops have already crossed the Soviet border, and Soviet cities like Odessa, Kyiv, and Minsk had been bombed by German aircraft for an hour and a half. Schulenburg said nothing, according to Molotov, with some tears in his eyes, in fact. At the end of the interview, all Molotov could stutter was, quote, "What have we done to deserve this?"
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.